He never imagined a simple walk to the corner store would turn into the moment that shattered everything he believed about safety, about community, about his own place in the world. One encounter, quick, violent, and completely unprovoked, left him staring at a reality he had tried so hard to ignore, a reality many people still deny exists. It wasn't the darkness of the night that threatened him. It was the darkness inside those who saw his skin as a threat before they ever saw him as a human being. Witnesses would later say it happened fast, like a storm dropping out of a clear sky. No warning, no reason, no mercy. And when the dust settled, he wasn't just fighting for justice. He was fighting to reclaim his dignity, his voice, and the truth of what really happened that night. Because what they tried to pin on him was a lie powerful enough to ruin a life. But the real story, the one they didn't want anyone to hear, starts long before that moment. He thought this was the worst night of his life, but what came after would shake him even more. Marcus had always lived a quiet, predictable life. Nothing fancy, nothing dramatic, just steady routines that kept him grounded. He worked long shifts at a small warehouse outside town, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, and most days passed without incident. After work, he'd walk home to the same stretch of neighborhood he'd known since childhood. The cracked sidewalks, the old oak tree on the corner, the distant hum of traffic. Everything felt familiar, safe, almost comforting. He took pride in minding his own business, keeping his head down, staying out of trouble. Friends often said he was the kind of man the world overlooked, gentle, hardworking, and easy to underestimate. But lately, he had noticed things changing around him. New faces in the neighborhood, cars slowing down a bit too long, people watching him with expressions he couldn't quite read. It wasn't enough to alarm him, not yet, but it lingered in the back of his mind on this particular evening. The air felt heavier than usual. Marcus couldn't explain why. Maybe it was the silence. Maybe it was the way the streetlights buzzed overhead. Or maybe it was a feeling that someone, somewhere, was paying attention to him in a way they never had before. If Marcus had known how quickly that uneasy feeling would turn into something far worse, he might have taken a different route. But by then, it was already too late. Marcus felt the shift before he understood it. That subtle unease from earlier in the evening sharpened into something heavier, something that pressed against his chest with every step he took. He walked with a steady pace, trying to shake off the tension crawling up his spine. But the neighborhood felt different tonight. Too quiet, too watchful, as if the shadows themselves were waiting for him to falter as he crossed the intersection near the old laundromat. He heard it, the low rumble of an engine creeping behind him. Not fast, not slow, just close enough to follow his pace. He didn't look back at first, forcing himself to focus on the sidewalk ahead, but the sound persisted, matching him step for step. His heartbeat picked up, pulsing through his ears like a warning drum. Finally, he glanced over his shoulder and saw a patrol car moving at a crawl, headlights dimmed, as though stalking rather than patrolling. Marcus tried to convince himself it was nothing, just an officer passing through. But then the car didn't pass. It lingered. The driver stayed locked onto him with an intensity that felt like a spotlight burning into his back. He kept walking, refusing to speed up or slow down, refusing to give any reason for extra attention. Still, the car followed. When he reached the end of the block, the patrol car suddenly swerved closer, rolling up beside him. A sharp burst of adrenaline surged through Marcus's body as the car edged him toward the curb. No words came from the person inside, no instructions, no questions, just an unspoken challenge, an assertion of power meant to intimidate. Marcus lifted his hands slightly, palms open, a small gesture of compliance he'd learned over years of caution. But the car didn't move away. Instead, another set of headlights appeared from the opposite direction. Another patrol car, then a third. They boxed him in without a sound, creating a cage of metal and suspicion around a man who had done nothing more than walk home. Marcus felt a cold dread seep into his bones. This wasn't routine. This wasn't random. This was deliberate. A group of officers stepped out, moving with a disturbing calm. They didn't treat him like a citizen. They didn't treat him like a person. They watched him the way someone might watch an animal. Calculating, cautious, ready to pounce at the slightest twitch. Marcus forced himself to stay still, to breathe evenly, to keep his mind from spiraling into panic. But the fear was there, alive and undeniable. They surrounded him slowly, cutting off every exit. The air thickened with judgment he hadn't earned, with assumptions he couldn't fight. One of the officers walked around him in a slow circle, eyes scanning him from head to toe as though trying to match him to some kind of threat. Another shined a flashlight into his face, blinding him. Marcus winced, but he did not move. He knew one wrong gesture could be twisted into something far more dangerous. The officers exchanged glances, silent communication he couldn't decode. And then, without explanation, they searched him, rough hands pulling at his clothes, patting down his pockets, treating him like a suspect long before any accusation was spoken. Marcus's mind raced. He had nothing on him. No contraband, no weapon, not even reason to be stopped. But innocence had never protected men who looked like him. When they found nothing, the officers didn't stop. They began questioning him with narrowed eyes and accusatory stares, twisting every harmless detail of his evening routine into something suspicious, something threatening. Why was he walking here? Where was he coming from? Did he know about a crime that had apparently taken place nearby, an incident Marcus couldn't have known about because it likely didn't even exist? Their tone made it clear. They weren't trying to discover the truth. They were trying to create one. Marcus felt anger rise beneath his fear, slow, burning, suffocating, not because he expected fairness, but because he had seen this happen to others, because he knew how quickly a simple stop could turn into a headline no one questioned. The officers grew more agitated the more he complied, as if his calmness threatened their version of events. And then it happened. One of them stepped closer, invading his space with blatant hostility. The officer's hand hovered near his holster, not drawing, but threatening, a silent message Marcus understood all too well. His pulse hammered against his ribs. He stood frozen, praying that his stillness would save him. But deep down, he sensed the situation slipping out of control. The officers were looking for a reason, any reason, to escalate. And Marcus was trapped, alone, and running out of time. What they did next would not only change the course of his night, it would ignite a storm that no one could ignore. The moment the tension snapped, it felt like the world tilted sharply against Marcus. One of the officers stepped closer, too close, his shadow merging with Marcus's as if trying to swallow him whole. The flashlight beam slammed into Marcus's face again, brighter this time, burning into his eyes until everything blurred. He blinked instinctively, and that tiny movement was all they needed. In an instant, the officers lunged. Hands grabbed his arms, twisting him behind his back with a violence meant to punish, not restrain. His knees buckled under the sudden force, scraping against the concrete as he struggled to stay upright. He wasn't resisting. He knew better than to even shift his weight, but they treated him like a threat anyway. The cold metal of handcuffs clamped around his wrists, cutting into his skin, sending a jolt of panic spiraling through him. He tried to breathe steady, tried not to let the rising terror consume him. But the officers weren't done. They shoved him forward, pressing his face against the hood of a patrol car, his cheek grinding against metal still warm from the engine. The world tilted sideways. His vision pulsed between shadow and streetlight, and each pulse reminded him of every story he had grown up hearing. Stories of men who looked like him pinned to the ground, silenced before they could ever speak their truth. Then someone shouted something he couldn't fully hear, accusing him of reaching for a weapon he never had. The lie hit him like a gut punch. A weapon? He didn't even have a backpack. No pockets deep enough to hide anything. No reason to carry something dangerous. But that didn't matter. The accusation alone was enough to justify whatever came next. An officer pushed harder on the back of his neck, forcing him lower until he could barely breathe. His pulse thundered in his ears, drowning out the distant sounds of startled neighbors stepping onto porches. Phones were raised, recording, watching. Marcus's heart pounded with a mix of fear and humiliation, knowing each breath he fought for could be his last. The officers barked orders he physically couldn't obey. They knew he couldn't. That was the point. His stillness was twisted into defiance, his silence labeled as guilt. When he tried to speak, just to ask what he was being accused of, a fist slammed into his ribs, stealing his breath. Pain radiated outward, sharp and immediate, but all he could think was, stay alive. Stay alive. That he felt the moment shift again. The officer stepped back as one of them announced to the gathering crowd that Marcus matched the description of a violent suspect. The wrong clothes, the wrong build, the wrong everything, but the right skin color. That was all it took. That was all they needed. But then, through the ringing in his ears, Marcus heard something else. Someone shouting from across the street. A witness who had filmed the entire encounter. A witness who knew exactly what happened. A witness who wasn't going to let the officer's story stand uncontested. The officers froze for a split second, just long enough for Marcus to sense it. The moment their narrative began to crack. And that crack was about to split wide open, because what happened next wouldn't just determine Marcus's fate. It would expose everything they tried so hard to hide. Marcus didn't remember the moment the officers finally loosened their grip. All he felt was a sudden absence of force. The weight lifted from his neck, the pressure released from his wrists, the world slowly coming back into focus. His body shook uncontrollably, not from cold, but from the shock that settled into his bones like a second skin. The officers stepped back only when they realized they were no longer alone in controlling the narrative. Phones were out. Voices whispered. That witness, the one brave enough to speak, had captured everything that in the glow of streetlights. Truth became impossible for them to hide. The ranking officer tried to regain control, shouting out rehearsed lines about reasonable suspicion and officer safety. But the crowd wasn't buying it. They had seen how Marcus walked, how he stood, how he barely breathed, terrified that any movement could trigger violence. They saw the officers escalate without cause, watched the force unfold in real time. The video showed it all. Hands grabbing him before words were spoken, accusations tossed before evidence existed. A story too familiar, too predictable, too painful. Marcus felt his knees give out for a moment, but a neighbor stepped forward to steady him. For the first time that night, Marcus felt human again, seen, protected, believed. The officers exchanged quiet glances, their confidence draining as more neighbors emerged, shaken by what they had witnessed. Eventually, the cuffs were removed, tossed aside with a muttered half-apology that didn't come close to acknowledging the harm done. They tried to end the encounter with the same control they started it with, walking back to their cars as if the night would simply fade into routine paperwork. But nothing about this night would fade, not for Marcus, not for the community, and certainly not for anyone who watched the video that spread through social media before dawn. When Marcus finally made it home, he sat alone in the dim light of his kitchen, trembling hands resting on the table. Every movement of the night replayed in loops, the engine creeping behind him, the circle closing around him, the cold metal biting into his skin, the lie, the weapon he never had, and the moment he thought his life was about to end for no reason other than the body he was born into. He wondered how many others had gone through this without a witness. How many stories were buried under claims of resisting or matching a description? How many families received apologies only after funerals? And how many never received anything at all? Marcus realized that his survival didn't erase the trauma. It didn't erase the humiliation. It didn't erase the truth. This could happen again. To him, to someone he loved, to anyone who shared his skin tone. The next morning, he filed a complaint with the department, supported by the witness's video and dozens of community statements. It sparked an internal investigation, one that the officers had not expected, one they had never imagined would come from a routine stop. There were interviews, press questions, and public outcry. The officers were placed on leave. For once, accountability seemed possible. His pain became a catalyst, not by choice, but by necessity. Marcus didn't ask to be a symbol. He didn't want to become another name in a long line of victims. He simply wanted to exist safely in his own community. But his story resonated because it exposed a truth too many already knew. Injustice grows in the silence between events like these. It thrives when people pretend it isn't happening. As he stood outside his home weeks later, watching children play on the sidewalks where he once walked freely, Marcus felt both hope and sorrow. Hope that the voices demanding change would not go quiet. Sorrow that it took his fear, his near disaster, for people to finally pay attention. And he wondered, deeply, painfully, How many more nights like his will it take before the world finally understands that no one should have to fear the simple act of walking home? Because this wasn't just Marcus's story. It was a story of countless others, past, present, and those yet to come. The real question isn't whether this can happen again. The real question is, what will we do to make sure it doesn't?